can I ask first of all, how many people for whom is this their first CSJ meeting of the conference? It's terrible because there's been so many already. Where have you been? If you haven't seen our programme, there is a programme I think on most people's seats for some of the other fringe meetings we've got to. So we will forgive you if we turn up to other ones that are still in the schedule. But thank you so much for coming to this one. And I should introduce myself. I'm Tim Montgomery. I was one of the co-founders with Ian Duncan Smith of the Centre for Social Justice. Nearly sort of 20 years ago. There he is, the man himself, Ian Duncan Smith. Welcome, Ian. And we're going to have a panel discussion on the cost of living. I'll introduce our panellists in a moment. But we're grateful, first of all, for James Crouch of Opinion, just to give us a little guide to some of the facts and figures and state of opinion on cost of living, just to put some of the debate, conversation we'll be having into context. So, James, thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll give you the floor.
Thank you. I get to do the nice, easy walk-on part at the beginning and don't actually have to be on the panel. So I will let the tech guys set up. So I'm James from Opinion. So you'll probably be most familiar with us as the polling firm who were actually most accurate in the 2019 general election, and also actually the Tory leadership race as well, by as it happens. So we did some research with the CSJ for this event. And so that was, well, rather than just looking at the cost of living as a whole, let's look at a specific element of that, which is the poverty premium. So we're going to look at trying to define it, what the impact from it, and why we should all basically really care about it. It works, that's good. So what is the actual definition of the poverty premium? And in a nutshell, I think it's quite an easy concept to get your head around. It's where low-income households are paying more for the same services and goods, or have higher barriers to access for those same services and goods. But that's pretty straightforward. We can do a little bit better in trying to define what that looks like, what that means, and what the things we need to plan for in future in dealing with that. So obviously, because we're researchers, I needed to include a methodology side, but it's not going to be a boring one, I promise. So how we actually went about doing this, so you can have a little bit of confidence in any of the numbers that we're going to talk through in the next few minutes, is that we actually conducted a large nationally representative survey. So not just 1,000 or 2,000, but 4,000 UK adults. We dig down into the low-income households within that, and Matt will be breaking into a cold sweat with all the work that we did on figuring out how we can define that. And then we looked at those who basically were penalised 2 or more times from what we count as a poverty premium. Now, I also want to highlight that we didn't just ask a quick list and leave it there. We actually worked through 9-10 questions, a whole series of elements about what are the potential premiums that you suffer from, and there's so much context behind all of these numbers. But we obviously can't go into all of that right now, but there'll be a lot more coming, I think. Watch the space. So in summary, of low-income households, 72% of them we count as being impacted by the poverty premium. So as I say, that's 2 or more of those kind of penalties for living in a low-income household. Now, even though I say 2 or more, one thing you'll probably find, and the text is quite small, but there's a lot going on in there. These are the 10 premiums that we summarized and went into our calculations. You'll see the really high percentages for pretty much all of them. So it's not just 2 or more. The actual average going on for these households is 3, 4. There's a really large proportion with 5 or more of these on this list. So the kind of things that went into it are, on one hand, kind of barriers to, for example, access utilities. So whether or not you pay for a paper bill, or whether or not you use a prepayment meter, which was the bane of my life while I was at university, or alternatively, access to financial services. So, for example, whether or not you pay to use cash machines, or whether or not you, for example, use high or expensive forms of credit. So such as we've included on the list, people who actually come to your house to offer you loans, for example, things like that. So there's a whole series of things that, and as I say, really high percentages for all of these pretty much. I mean, even the 22% going to the most expensive kind of corner shops for your groceries, even that's really quite high for this group. So obviously we focused on that kind of financial and that energy impact, but the thing that we thought would actually be kind of most highlight why this is actually a huge issue that we need to be dealing with, because I think we can all get our head around oh yes, that makes sense. Yes, I understand there's now a higher cost for this group. There's a double penalty for them. I guess the big impact is that societal element. So what does it mean outside of that? What is the impact it's having on these people? So from there, we then wanted to have a look and say, okay, fine, how are you responding to the cost of living? What impact is that having on you? And you see some quite shocking things. So these are just 4 of the points we wanted to highlight from there. Once again, there's a whole series of questions that went behind these, and there's an awful lot of really quite shocking stuff in there. As I say, watch this space. The 4 we wanted to highlight are, I guess, the 2 on the left-hand side. So before I'll get into that, the pink is the percentages on the poverty premium. So that's saying that they're doing this to kind of respond to the cost of living crisis. And then the kind of lighter green that we're not going to worry about too much is the kind of wider population as a whole. But what you'll see quite initially is 1 in 8 on the poverty premium say that they're using food banks as a way of dealing with the cost of living crisis. I think 1 in 6 actually gambling as a form of earning income, additional income. Now you can see that's 3 times, in both those cases, pretty much 3 times the national average for those. So that is one really obvious way that we're actually highlighting the huge differences and impact those kind of premiums are feeding into and having. There's an element as well of talking about the benefit of financial management. There's a lot that we kind of worked on that, so I've got to kind of summarize it with one stat saying that they feel like they would benefit from basically more support in managing their finances, but there's an awful lot we can talk about that. And then very finally, I really hate to actually end the presentation on this very dark note, but actually the very serious element of actually turning to other substances to basically cope. So we actually found that 11% on the poverty premium said that in response to the kind of current crisis, they're actually turning to alcohol to help them cope. And those are really quite shocking numbers. And I hate to actually end it on that note, but on that, I will actually hand it over back to the panel. And hope that was a good start.
Well, it's a really helpful start and really informative. And I look at some of my colleagues in the CSJ, but we're good to tweet some of those slides out, I think, if we haven't done already, so that they reach a wider audience. But thank you. And I'm sure in our question and answer period later, we can come back to some of those things. So we're going to go to our panel now. The panel will speak for sort of 2 to 5 minutes each, and then hopefully we'll have a good amount of time for you to ask questions. I'll introduce the panel members all briefly now, and then turn to them one at a time. First, who's going to speak is my local MP, John Glen. So first of all, I've got some pothole questions to raise. Now, John is not only my local MP, he's a lovely friend, and I backed Liz Truss for the leadership, and he backed Rishi Sunak. We didn't necessarily agree, but he's one of the most competent Treasury ministers we've had for a very long time.
Not anymore.
No. And that's the issue. It's a real shame that people of John's competence and experience in government aren't still on the front bench. I hope that's corrected very, very soon. We don't have Tamara Dewhurst from Virgin Money, who's very kindly supporting this event with us today, but we do have Piers Claughton, who will speak then. Thank you very much, Piers, for coming in at short notice. And then we have my colleague at GB News. I'm really glad that Esther McVey is normally putting me on the spot, asking me difficult questions when I appear on her show with Phil, which is 10 till 12, Fridays and Saturdays, isn't it? If you're not already a GB News viewer, I hope you will, just to tune in to Esther's brilliant show. Esther, of course, a former worker pension secretary, she will then speak. And then my colleague at the Centre for Social Justice, Matthew Greenwood, who is more expert on these issues than almost any of us. Perhaps definitely more than others, who will conclude our panel discussion. But John, can I ask you to speak first, please?
Well, thank you very much, Tim, and it really is great to be here. I do think the Centre for Social Justice, what it's achieved over the last 19 years under Ian's leadership, has been remarkable, because what you've done is thrown a focus on the most vulnerable in society, the complexity of the life situations that people find themselves in, and created a platform for policy development for government. And that is needed more than ever over this coming season. I think you're all familiar with the inflation figures, the crisis that's caused by the energy disruption in supply, and I could rehearse all the interventions that sequentially have been put in by the Treasury and what was announced last week. I'm not going to do that because I think all of those facts are known. I just want to talk a little bit about financial inclusion, because when I was a minister for the last 4.5 years, one of the areas of my work was looking at what we could do in terms of financial inclusion to address the issues on that slide around poverty premium, the fact that for many people in society, they cannot access things that all of us take for granted on a reliable basis or without paying more for it. 6 months into my tenure in the Treasury, we worked with the FCA on a review of affordable credit. We've got to accept that there will always be high cost credit. The challenge was always to bring it into a more acceptable frame. Putting a bar on the amount of interest, avoiding rollover loans where people were going and actually getting people to borrow more to get rid of the debt that they had. Those things were welcome. I also tried to move forward with credit union reform, and I'm pleased to say that the Financial Services and Markets Bill will give credit unions, larger credit unions in particular, the opportunity to offer more services. Often they are a reliable touch point for people in the greatest need to be able to access a degree of financial resilience. The no interest loan scheme, which has been piloted at the moment in South Manchester, which will give no interest loans to various people, and I hope that we will be able to see that grow extensively to offer people an alternative to some of the high cost credit options. Access to cash is another area that the government will be bringing forward, has brought forward in the bill that I left on the table when I left in July, a guarantee of access to cash, because we've seen the provision of access to cash fall off a cliff as our behaviours change and the way that we use banks. That is something that is really important. The thing is, we see innovation in financial services, buy now, pay later, a good thing for many of us to be able to defer the costs over and spend money over a longer period. But there's been no check on people using that on multiple occasions. Each one who offers you a buy now, pay later product doesn't actually check whether you've got 3 or 4 others, leading people into unsustainable debt. And that's something the government's going to move to deal with. I also think financial education is important. We did bring in the imperative to have financial education in secondary schools, but because of the complexity and different settings that academies in particular operate under and the discretion of how to interpret that, it's not a universal, reliable provision. Robin Walker and I were talking about putting that into primary education, getting financial education into the maths curriculum much earlier on, because we need to be serious. If we're going to change mindsets, it needs to happen much earlier. So those are some of the things that government was actually doing and will be taking forward. But what is really clear to me is that there was some talk over the summer about the need to end handouts. No, there isn't. There can't be. There are some people who are in such a vulnerable state. There isn't a growth imperative or outcome that's going to resolve the situation for that group of people this coming autumn and winter. And therefore, I very much welcome the approach taken by Rishi Sunak to actually find sums of money targeted at the most vulnerable, targeted on those on means-tested benefits, the disabled, the pensioners, and people who can't earn more money. And obviously, I welcome too the intervention by the new Chancellor to put a cap on the unit price of energy. But the final thing I want to say is that these are complex matters. There won't be a single set of solutions from government that will resolve all those issues that were on the slides in the earlier presentation. But it will be by creating resilience in local communities with different configurations of relationships between local authorities, churches, and other charitable entities that will find solutions that suit different communities. But we have got to be clear that there are groups of people who are excluded, and this isn't right. And we as a Conservative Party, I as a Member of Parliament, care about these things. Trussell Trust, the food banks were founded in Salisbury, an affluent part of our country. Every community in this country has pockets of poverty, and we as Conservatives must continue to strive to find practical solutions.
Thank you very much, John. And just to echo what you said about the language, handouts, etc. Now, I'm incredibly proud that as a Conservative government, we do look after the people at the bottom of the part, or we do help people through difficult times, I think it's incredibly important the language that we use. And the idea of a language like handouts does almost seem like it's not something we want to give, that it's grudging. And I think we need to, language like social security means something. It's a very resonant phrase. And so care with language is sometimes almost as important as care with policy. Anyway, without further ado, Piers, again, thank you so much for being with us today. And the floor is yours. Piers from Virgin Money.
Thank you. Well, I assume that the news that I was going to sit on the panel has caused the bump in the queues outside the door. I'm delighted to be here, both co-sponsoring the event, but also co-sponsoring this really important piece of research. It's a topic that is really impacting the daily lives of so many people in the UK at the moment. And the rising cost of living is going to see many people experience financial difficulty, possibly for the first time. And I think it's really important that, that even though I have to say currently our data isn't showing a huge change in people's circumstances in terms of arrears, what we're hearing on the ground from customers day to day is this is something that's a real worry to them. We, like many businesses and the government, need to step up and support those that are experiencing financial difficulties for the first time. But this research really underlines that those that are already struggling are going to be even further impacted by the cost of living, and this is just going to continue. In 2020, Virgin Money made a commitment through our ESG strategy to try, it was an ambition, to try and end the poverty premium for our customer base by 2030. As you've already heard, the poverty premium is the extra charge that those on low income pay for essential services. However, whilst we at Virgin Money have made that commitment, as a bank, we don't have all the answers. We can only work within our own industry. And very quickly we realised that a lot of the solutions were beyond our scope and required involvement from other sectors to tackle specific premiums and also some of the wider challenges like digital exclusion. We've engaged with many of these sectors already, and we understand some of the barriers and also some of the perceived barriers to change. And we've sought to work with them and experts in the field as well to understand what potential short-term solutions we can deliver, but also what those long-term solutions could be. John was incredibly helpful about a year ago in pulling together a round table on the poverty premium. John, you probably don't remember me. I was the person who was frantically taking notes and taking pictures.
I do remember.
And that was really helpful in bringing together some of those interested parties. In terms of short-term solutions, one of the biggest impacts that we've managed to make as a bank recently is around our around the sort of boosting income, because we see there are two elements. There's boosting income and helping people to save. Now, the boosting income bit, trying to help people to identify possibly benefits that they're entitled to, but they're not aware of. So we work quite closely with DWP, who is hosting a campaign around trying to drive up take up of the pension credits. And we embedded on our website, I believe it's in about 14 places on our website, consumer-facing pages of our website, a benefits calculator that was put together by the charity Turn to Us. In 10 minutes, you can find out your eligibility for all benefits. We ran a very short and relatively cheap social media campaign targeting over 65s on Facebook, trying to myth bust some of the myths around having savings and those kind of things. And to date, we've had 5,000 people complete the tool, and we've delivered almost or over £1 million worth of benefits to those who have used the tool. So that's a huge bump. The cost of living crisis, though, has brought into focus the urgent challenges facing consumers, most notably on energy. And at the moment, that's the main focus. But there are many more sort of challenges that we've seen around the poverty premium that we need to look at. And I think it's not only about helping people in the immediate at the sharp end, but it's also about trying to tackle some of these bigger problems. So when we come out of the cost of living crisis, they've potentially got more money in their pockets to build up financial resilience going forward. This is an opportunity, and it's a weird thing to say, the cost of living crisis is an opportunity, but it feels like this is a moment where business and government are really focused on how they can help customers. So the poverty premium, this is an absolute perfect opportunity to really try and address some of those big poverty premium challenges that so far have eluded us. I'm really delighted that so many people have come to this today, and I really hope that many of you in the audience will join Virgin Money, CSJ and others in trying to tackle the poverty premium going forward.
Thank you so much, Piers. And we often hear of financial institutions for the worst of reasons. That's what the news tends to focus on. But here, the practical help that you're giving to your customers is encouraging, and we're really proud as a centre to be working with you on this project. So the time is now approaching 11:47. You're watching GB News. I'm here with Esther. Esther, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I want to take a little step back, as it were, and just sort of ponder what we've been doing for the last 2 years. So who on earth thought that closing the economy and the country down for 2 years, pay people to stay at home and print money at will and think we could get away with it? Who thought that could happen? Who thought that could be damage-free? It couldn't be, and it wasn't. The lockdowns will go down in history as one of the most idiotic policies ever to have occurred, and something we must never, ever do again. Now, some of us tried to warn continuous lockdowns would have consequences, but no one at the time really wanted to listen. And I have to say, Labour would have got it far worse, because they wanted to lock down harder and longer. And thank goodness a Conservative government did open up the economy, but way, way too late. So here we are now, and I guess these are some of my thoughts. So broadly speaking, despite the Chancellor's, and it can only be described as ham-fisted mini-budget, his approach and the approach of Conservatives is to make sure that people keep more of their own money. And that is the right way to go. Businesses keeping more, individuals keeping more, because we are certainly not under-taxed. The freedom from tax this year was the 8th of June. In the 1990s, it was early May. So we continue taxing. And that, so as I said, I think thinking about how much we're paying tax was the right thing to do. But the government does have to reduce spending, and that's what it wasn't looking at, it didn't focus on. And that was not just because of Friday's budget, it had been going out of control for the last 2 years significantly. But I do want to focus particularly on benefits and the welfare system, and what the government could be doing and what it needs to learn from in the past. So when David Cameron became the Prime Minister, it was the biggest peacetime budget deficit in our history. And we had to look at what the welfare budget was doing, and it was increasing at a rate of knots. It was clearly unsustainable, and it had to be dealt with. But it was done in a way, a Conservative way, about extending opportunities and about empowerment. It was about getting people into work, giving them an opportunity. And Ian Duncan Smith is here, and Ian Duncan Smith led that. And by the end,
I think he's suggesting with you, Esther.
with me, thank you very much indeed. And towards the end, we were getting 1,000 more people into work each and every day to give them an opportunity. And why I mention that, at the moment we have 1.3 million job vacancies. The mental impacts that lockdown had on people were considerable. We know hundreds of thousands of people have left the workforce, or they're not working in the same way as they did. So that compassionate conservatism has to come to the fore again to help people get back to work, to understand what lockdown has done to the psychology of our community. Now, I have to say, that it would be a huge mistake not to give a cost of living increase in the benefits. It cannot be that the books are balanced on the back of benefits. That is not right at all. What we have got to do is help people back into work, and that will not be done by slashing the benefit budget. It is about supporting the poorest in society, but showing them there is a better way, and with those job vacancies out there, there is a way for them. We've just got to be an enabler, and that's what government does, and working with business. And this is really where we've all got to come together, the individual, businesses and government, to be a massive enabler from which we will all benefit.
Well, that's fantastic stuff. It's wonderful to hear someone say the MP talking so passionately about making sure people at the bottom of the pile are protected. Esther, thank you for everything you do. And I know Ian and Betsy, it's lovely to see you here with us as well today. I know Ian and Betsy have got to go off to a bigger meeting on Ukraine in a minute, so I will say I know you've got to leave, so thank you for joining us briefly. Yeah, Ian has a question. I can't really deny it.
I only want to.
I'm sorry, everyone else, that he's jumping the queue.
Yeah, you're sacked. Right, anyway, the only thing I just want to say, thanks for the panel and everything else, I just want to pick up on the figures here. You've got to be slightly careful with those figures that you reduce because they're quite narrow. We've always known that being poor is more expensive because of all the hurdles that are put in your way with regards to, it's not worse, yes, agree, because the move from cash is the biggest issue, and also the mess we got into over payday lending, the crash in that's left us with nothing else. Now we did a report here saying that now poor people have to go to really dodgy lenders, whereas the other ones were a problem. We've now got them over now into the worst kind of lending where it's violent, it's nasty and dangerous. So these are the areas. And the other one I'd say about these figures is look again at lifestyles is very important. The bottom decile is a messy decile. When you look at it, it's got students in it as well, which tends to give you a bit of a problem. Most of those will go on up into the income scale. So the second and third deciles are the key. The point I would make though, yesterday we had a very good meeting, and it was on the point that Esther was making, which is what is the fallout from the lockdowns. So this was an experiment never undertaken by the free world ever. So we did it not just once, we did it 3 times, nearly did it 4 times. The fallout for the poorest has been breathtaking.
Huge.
We now know that the scale of those who've gone missing from school is staggering. It's increased far more. We know that in primary schools, the kids from the poorest families were 18 months behind. They're now, God knows, beyond 2 years behind in their education. So these things need investment in things like remedial education, finding who the kids are that are not back in schools yet. There's a big area on that. These are areas where we should invest. And so the only point I'd make is when you discuss this, you need also to bring into the case, broken families, failed education, the issues of debt. All of these make a more rounded package, which the CSJ is looking at. But when you discuss this, it isn't simplistic. Tony Blair talked about handouts, and nobody got on it. Handouts is a pejorative phrase. It's about how do you get people to move on up into the system and help themselves. And that's what you seem all about. I think you did it. But thanks very much indeed for the panel. This is a really important discussion. And I'm not going to talk about what happened this morning. Bye-bye.
Bye, Betsy.
Bye.
Well, thank you. I think I'm going to sack him now because that wasn't a question, that was a point. So, but you'll all do better, I'm sure, in the audience in a few minutes. But Matthew Greenwood, my colleague at the CSJ, final member of the panel before we do open it up to all of you. Matthew, thank you.
Thank you. So I think the thing that we've learned over the last few years is that as a country, we have a deep resilience problem. COVID forced everyone into their houses and we had to pay people's salaries because they just don't have much to fall back on. And as the cost of living crisis is also showing us, prices go up and the amount of people who say they will save absolutely nothing in the next 12 months goes right up with it. Because people don't have any room to move. And it's important that, as we've seen, the government focuses on financial inclusion. It focuses on what it can do to shield the people at the bottom of the income spectrum. applaud the current Chancellor for the 2,500 average cap. But I think that there's a lot of things that we still need to work on. And there's some of the things we've seen today. There's clearly problems in markets. The premiums that we've seen today show that people who are at the bottom pay more for basic goods and services. They continue to get a pretty bad deal, usually due to cash flow problems. You know, the reason people pay for their insurance on a monthly basis rather than an annual basis is because they can't afford it at the beginning of the year. The reason that people go to buy now, pay later firms and to high-cost credit providers is because they present riskier profiles that creditors don't always take account of. It's about measuring if you will pay as well as when you can pay. And we need to do more about that. John, as he mentioned, has got a sort of big piece in the financial services bill, which is going to improve access to affordable credit, particularly in credit unions. And I think that we need to continue to grow those options, because at the end of the day, people are going to search for money. And when they can't afford something, they will go elsewhere. Not everyone can go without. Not when your washing machine breaks, not when you can't afford food. And people will turn to more malicious figures, to illegal lenders, as we've seen. But we need to deal with that. We also need to deal with insurance, as I mentioned. And then we also need to deal with this big economic inactivity problem. People are exiting the labour markets. Some elderly people are leaving because they simply don't need to work anymore. They have enough money not to do it. But I think there is a real problem, particularly at the lower end of the age spectrum, where we had a lockdown and a lot of kids stayed at home, maybe left their jobs if they just sort of started getting into one, and didn't go back. And we know from what we do at the CSJ that work is something which the longer you are out of it, the more likely you are to stay out of it. And when we're dealing with the cost of living, what we need to do is ensure that people get as much money as they can, and the best way to do that is through working. And therefore I think that's another big thing that I would want to focus on. Because this is ultimately how I guess we're going to tackle this crisis. Because if work is the best means of earning money, we've seen the things the government has done to improve that. We've seen a cut in the taper rate. We've seen a modest increase in work allowances. But the sums do have to add up if people are going to go back to work. And I guess what I would sort of just briefly close on, and let's get to questions, would be that unless we do things, people are going to support people. People are going to leverage themselves more. They're going to borrow credit that they might not be able to afford. And that will lead to higher delinquency rates. It will lead to a higher instance of people getting marks on their credit profiles. And it will damage their long-term financial prospects for several years. And it will lead to the sort of social effects that we've seen on the slide. People turning to alcohol, people going to food banks, not particularly things I think that we want to represent this country. And therefore, I guess that's what I would, briefly open with. And that's what we're going to focus on.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Matthew. Right, we're going to have a period of questions and answers now. You know how normally in sessions the speakers overrun? We've actually underrun today, so we've got 10 minutes more for questions. We've got a full half an hour of questions, which hopefully will be a fruitful time. What I will ask the panelists to do, let's not ask every panelist answer every question. And if you've got something you want to say, come in. But let's try and get as many questions as we can. And when you ask a question, if you don't mind, perhaps say where you're from, which part of the country, or whether you represent an organisation. That would be useful as well. And Angela at the back first. If you introduce yourself though, Angela.
Thanks, Tim. I'm Angela Salt, I'm the Chief Executive of Guiding. I just wanted to bring the panel and the room's attention to the perhaps inadvertent effect of the cost of living crisis on volunteering. So our organisation relies on tens of thousands of volunteers. There's hundreds of thousands across the UK that underpin civil society. And what we're finding is that if you're in part-time work, or you have to maybe take more jobs or take more hours in your job, and it's very directly affecting your ability to volunteer. And finally, it's having a gendered impact, if you like, because women are more likely to do caring, more likely to be in part-time jobs, more likely to be in low-paid jobs, and particularly in our case, it's affecting their ability to volunteer. I just think it's an important issue that we're all aware of in terms of the impact, perhaps side impacts of the cost of living, in this case on volunteering. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone would like to take that one?
Well, I totally agree. Not only has it had an impact on volunteers, it's had an impact on charities with charitable donations. I mean, it's been massive. Lots of charities have lost about 70% of their income. The volunteer issue, though, and again, is very, very complicated, because you will also see the over 50s in the country have taken, as it were, an early retirement during lockdown. You've got hundreds of thousands of people who've taken a step out of the workplace. So my issue is, what have we done to those people mentally, I think, that feel they want to, some of them use the expression, to step off the conveyor belt of life. So what have we done? And therefore, how do we now get them back to volunteering, whether it's coming out of the house, engaging, getting there, being energized, feeling positive, and getting them back into the workplace? So very, very complicated. But you're quite right, it has damaged charity and voluntary organisations.
Anyone else on the panel?
Could I just add to that? I mean, I know it's slightly off topic on this, but as an employer, I think it's really important that that we give the opportunity for people to have interests and activities outside of work, because that increases a bit more richness. And at Virgin Money, we've done a lot in this space around Life More Virgin, which is around looking at how we can make employment more flexible, so it works around pickups and drop-offs of your kids, caring responsibilities, and other interests. And I think we're not the only business doing that, but I think it's really important that, particularly when people have been locked down for 2 years, there is one of the positives of that is that some people feel a little bit more connected with the communities that they live in rather than the communities that they work in, and trying to build that connection through the ability to do voluntary work and having a bit of time to do that is a really positive thing.
Lady straight at the back there, I think.
Thank you very much. I'm Judith Donovan. I chair a campaign called Keep Me Posted, and we campaign for the consumer's right to receive paper bills and statements. We have extensive neuroscience research which shows there's a massive increase in comprehension and retention of information looked at on paper. With one test we did, only 32% of people looking at the bank statement online could remember it accurately, 82% could see it on paper. Every mainland country in Europe has private legislation protecting the right to paper or statement. Is it time we have that legislation in this country?
Absolutely fascinating. I was completely ignorant of those numbers. I would definitely like to follow up on that. John, can I invite you to?
I mean, I think this goes to the heart of the challenge of the world's changing rapidly. How do you accommodate people who aren't going to adapt to that in a way that actually is achievable? And that's why with banking, we're having banking hubs. 4 years ago, I was told it wouldn't happen. And it does happen. What happens is now you can actually have where the last bank closes, you bring everyone together, and you have 4 banks operating out of one building, each doing a day a week, and this is an effective solution. And we'll see those rolled out more and more. I've not encountered that particular campaign. You will see, I'm sure, over the coming years, more and more people adapting, as my mother who's 74, to using things digitally, feeling a bit uncomfortable, but adjusting to that. I think there's a judgment to be made about what's the interim solution as things change over the coming years. But we can't hold back the fundamental shifts that have happened quite rapidly in how we don't use cash anymore, for example. What we've got to do is find practical solutions. And that's why I welcome some of the things that happened from financial services firms. I was with HSBC yesterday, and for example, what they've done with actually working on a scheme to allow homeless people to access banking through proxies. We need financial services firms like Virgin Money and others to find solutions for those most vulnerable. They have a responsibility to do that. They shouldn't be the primary deliverers of social policy, but they do have a responsibility to be responsible corporate actors in society. And I think that we need to work with organisations like yours to find practical ways of addressing the concerns of that group. And I'm very happy to work with you to take that forward from the backbenches.
I'm going to put Piers on the spot now as a representative of the financial community. What's Virgin Money's view on paper?
I mean, I think it's following on from John. I think we've got to be conscious that the way that customers are banking is changing. But similarly, we do need to be cognizant of serving all of our customers. And I think it's really important that we find solutions to these challenges. And I think particularly at this moment where we're talking about the cost of living, I think this is exactly the right time to be talking to organisations like yourself, Judith, about understanding what those challenges are for your cohorts that you represent and seeing how we can work with you to address them.
And Judith, it doesn't sound sort of perverse. Where can people find you online if they want to find out a bit more about your work?
We have a very good website with all the research on it. Keep Me Posted UK.
Keep Me Posted.uk?
No, just Keep Me Posted UK.
But it must have a domain name. Keep Me Posted. Just search for that.
Don't trip over the Brussels one.
Yeah. Okay. Never go to the Brussels one. That's always good advice. Right. Gentleman there in the red tie. Yes, you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. My name's Joe Robertson. I'm leader of the Conservative Council Group on the Isle of Wight. I suppose it's probably a question directed to Esther, but maybe John might want to comment. Esther, your early comments today, you said that you basically criticised the previous government's approach to lockdowns, but I think also their economic policy. And I think we've seen this coming out of number 10 as well, a criticism of previous Conservative governments, not just of the last 2 years, but the last 10 years. And it looks like it's a tactic to distance the new government from that and to help justify the decisions that are now being made. And I do worry that it looks like to the voters that the cost of living crisis has been made by previous Conservative governments. And I do worry that it's harpooning future election successes by seemingly blaming everything up until September this year on previous Conservative chancellors and prime ministers. I just wondered whether you had a view on the risk around
Very
that.
astute question. Thank you. That's
So, Joe, if you looked at my voting record, I'm not saying it now, I was one of very few who voted against. I think the first vote, I think there was only 4 of us who voted against it. It did actually increase. So, on the lockdown, except for the first one, the March to the June 1st one, when nobody knew what was happening, which I completely agreed with, after that, I was vocal and spoke out. So I'm not saying anything here. I do not distance myself from the years before, and that's why I was explaining what we did in the welfare system, the benefit system, what we did, extending opportunity. I am saying that the lockdown was awful. And by the way, what I also said, Labour would have done it worse. They wanted to lock down harder and longer and would have kept it going. So I'm not, whilst I didn't agree, and I don't agree with the lockdown policies, and we said, and this is what I think the Conservative Party needs to do now, is say it wasn't over in 2 years. This is actually going to be a 10-year policy that we're going to have to vote for. All of the political class at the time, 600 and odd, were walking through the lobby. So they can't walk away from it either, but this is what we're going to have to do. And how do we come out of it now? The cost of living was fundamentally from that. And what do we do using good Conservative policies? We've got us out of this mess before, after the financial crash, when Labour were in. How do we use our policies to move forward? So that's what it is. But I am a Conservative, and I'll stand by that. I'll say one of the few in Merseyside, and I always have been, and I will remain thus.
Can't you, John, just to comment on that? Not so much, I don't think we want to debate on lockdown here today, but just a general position I think that Joe was raising, that MPs are sort of, Tory MPs are sort of trying to detach themselves from the government which they've largely voted for. How worried are you about that?
Well, I think there's a great tendency after you've had such a divisive and prolonged conversation with each other over the summer to go down that route. And that's very unwise. I mean, we need to unite as a party if we're going to have a chance of winning an election. but I think we also need to focus on how to get that right. And I think one of the things that I'd like to add and build on what Esther said was around what we spend. We've spent a lot of money, but I see less and less conversations within the Conservative Party about the effectiveness of what we spend in terms of value for money. What outcomes do we get from what we spend in education, benefits in the health service? And that doesn't mean to say that's not a proxy for saying we should cut, because I agree with Esther, we should not be cutting benefits at this difficult time. But I do think, particularly with the NHS, which seems to be on an escalator of additional monies every year, and I saw it in government over the last 2.5 years through the COVID experience, the emotional arguments and the superficial interrogation of the needs of different government departments, is very sad, because what happens is more and more money is spent and you don't secure actually good value for money. Now, in a crisis situation, you will never get that completely right, and it's easier on the outside to criticise. But I do think the Conservative Party must now unite, but we must also be plain about where we're spending money and what outcomes are we securing from it. Because if we don't, sound money, will be lost as a hallmark of our identity, and that's going to be very damaging for us electorally. People need to know that both sides of the ledger are being looked at with equal focus and determination.
Lady at the back in the pink jacket. It's got to be a reward for having stood the whole meeting.
Thank you. Councillor Dr. Glen Johnson from Wirral Council. What are your thoughts on geographical disparity? Why is London so centric in our country still when it simply does not need to be so? I sit here from a Wirral perspective. We're a beautiful area of the country, 4 grammar schools, incredible education, access to the coast, etc. Chester's a fabulous city up the road. Why on earth are so many businesses still based in London when they don't need to be?
Do you want to put John, and then I want to bring Matt in because you haven't heard.
Well, I mean, it's a complex problem based on a lot of history and the problem of a network of businesses and financial services in the city that actually it makes economic sense to bring things together because you have efficiencies. Now, I've been on quite a journey on this. When I was PPS to Philip Hammond, one young backbencher, Rishi Sunak, came in and said, I want free ports, and the Treasury orthodoxy was, that they aren't very effective. He then became Chancellor a few years later, he put them in, and now we're going further. I think what we've got to do, though, is not get into a situation where I think we can just randomly redistribute and it is effective economically. You're absolutely right. There are great places outside of London and the southeast.
Salisbury.
Of course. But the problem is, to have effective, enduring investment, you need to have specialist hubs. I don't think the government should be designing those and designating those around the country. They sort of grow where you get good infrastructure, which we're rightly putting in. But it is not feasible or realistic to have multiple hubs of economic activity of the concentration of London based on the historical reality of what it is. What this government is about, and had a mandate for in 2019, is to move the dial on that issue. But it's not something that we're going to be able to do immediately. But what we've got to do is make sure that we make sound investments that aren't just about papering over the cracks with little bits of extra money to satisfy local newspapers in the short term. We've got to find enduring changes in the fabric of the infrastructure of our country that make investment outside of London a no-brainer. And I think we're beginning to see that. We need to accelerate that over the next 2 years.
Matt, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I'd echo an awful lot of that. We've seen, very long-term economic agglomeration effect in London, which means that for a lot of graduates, myself included, all roads lead to, right? I'm from a small seaside town in the east of England, and I'd love to go back and live there, but I wouldn't find a job. And therefore, what we need to focus on is what we can do in those economies to take advantage of all of the potential that they do have. Coastal economies, free ports are a great example. And we've just had a lack of long-term capital expenditure. And therefore, I think the people who get left behind are the ones that are often facing a lot of the problems we're talking about today, right? They're people who are more likely to use high-cost credit. They're people who are more likely to have debts deducted from their universal credit payments. And if we keep saddling these areas by encouraging everyone who feels they're worth their salt to move out, what else do we expect? And I think that the final thing I'd say on the capital expenditure thing is, what the biggest capital expenditure project we've done in a very long time was the Elizabeth line. Where's Northern Powerhouse Rail?
Now, it's completely true what Matt says about all roads leading to London in so many ways, but one of the reasons I'm proud of the CSJ and what Andy Cook, his current chief executive, has done with it is there are now a number of CSJ offices outside of London. Just very briefly, Andy, do you want to say where those offices are now?
Yeah, we've got one in the northwest, one in the northeast, one in the Midlands. We were going to put one in Yorkshire, but we know there's no social problems in Yorkshire.
Says a man from Leeds.
Yeah, we don't need to be there. But yeah, we're going across the country because we know that's where we need to be, and people are kind of not just screaming out with problems, by the way, screaming out with solutions, and often done in the little platoons, the businesses around there. We've got to get behind it, so we are.
So yeah, lots of London think tanks, but not all of the London think tanks are completely London. Esther, can you say something? Do you want to say something about the Wirral?
Well, I would say hallelujah. One of the reasons I came into politics was to hopefully raise the voice of the North, but also to say that the whole country benefits if the North is achieving its full potential. So when George Osborne did come out with the Northern Powerhouse, what we were going to do to get that engine going, fantastic. The free ports John talked about there, excellent. Merseyside would have benefited from there. So really, you're right, we needed the railway line to connect the North. And I would say, look, everybody, when you're looking about saving money, get rid of high speed 2. What we all needed was high speed broadband, and that would be a huge liberator for anybody in the country if we were all connected on line. So I think the opportunities are great. I think the potential there is great, and I think it's that digital connectivity now that can expand us, because the universities across the North as well are doing lots of science, lots of IT, and obviously the new energies, with hydrogen, whatever, whether it's battery powered, whether it's a car manufacturing industry. So yes, a big hallelujah to Wirral West to there.
Matthew also stood at the back.
Yeah, my name's Matthew Patton. I work at the CSJ. My question is this: Kwasi Kwarteng is obviously having quite a busy day, and he's standing up.
We weren't going to mention that.
But he's standing up to give his speech this afternoon, and his entire speech is really framed by the question on the top of the slide in this panel, which is how to tackle the cost of living crisis. What would the panel like him to say in his speech this afternoon to address the cost of living crisis?
But Matt, you go first. I think every panelist should answer this one. So Matt, you go first. What should Kwasi Kwarteng say this afternoon when he gets up to speak?
Well, I think that what we've heard today is that letting people keep more of their money is usually the best thing. And yes, you can cut taxes for people like me who don't really need the extra money. I won't complain. But there are
Did you
people.
hear that, Andy?
Wage freeze at the CSJ.
But there are people, across this country who do really need that money. People who are on universal credit and in work, because those people are working hours and hours, just like the rest of us, and they get an awful lot of their claim taken away from them. So we've seen the taper rate cut, good. What about we now look at work allowances and raise those back to their former levels, so that people who are in work keep more of their money?
John.
But I think we've got to say it's about short, medium, and long term. And I think the challenge is to add to the narrative around growth, which is the right one. We do need to grow the economy. We do need to be very clear that we have got to come out of the challenges of the last 5 years with a new approach to delivering growth. And that will need to build on what Boris Johnson's government did in terms of investment and infrastructure, and as Esther said, the digital infrastructure in particular. That is absolutely clear. But what we have also got to recognise is that the agenda that the CSJ has promoted so assiduously over the last 19 years is also very important. We need to be a united country that recognises that for the poorest, this is going to be an incredibly challenging time. And therefore we need to support people, as the new Chancellor set out in the energy support package, through these difficult times. We mustn't revert to a narrative that says there are people who are relying on benefits and they shouldn't be uprated properly. We need to see people through this difficulty, but then actually focus on some of the issues that Esther has raised around actually why are people not working when they could? Why do we have all these vacancies? How are we going to get that momentum around getting the country working in new industries, in new ways, in more flexible ways? And I agree with the agenda of the government to look carefully at where you can make supply side changes that make doing business more effective, and not at the expense of creating more vulnerabilities for those who have less. And I think it's that bit of the narrative that our party and the country needs to hear more about this afternoon. And I wish the Chancellor well. This is obviously an incredibly challenging time for him, and we need him to be successful this afternoon.
Yeah.
I did sort of mention it, and that was high speed too. I mean, whenever you have something that starts off with a cost of 37 billion and then goes up to 150 billion northwards, you have to say, is this really something we want to continue with? And also, it's never had one business case. We're up to now the 4th business case. So I would say we have to get rid of high speed 2. It could be that it has to stop a crew. It might be that so much work has been done to there. But as I said, it's 157 billion pounds and northwards, and I think that would be a huge amount. Even if it were only 100 billion to put back into your kitty, I think that would be a good way to start. And he needs to start looking at grandiose schemes. And do you need it? Is it value for money? And does it still serve a purpose? There's still people going into city on a train. So that's where I'd start.
Piers?
Oh, carry on talking. Very good. Thank you.
More time to think there. I mean, I'm going to neatly sidestep what I want him to say and focus a little bit more on what I'd like him to do. And I think it's quite straightforward from our perspective. I think we've reached a point with the policy premium where I think the government to sort of sponsor the work on this would be really helpful. Bringing together all the industries to talk about the premium, to understand what solutions are there, and try and find some business-led solutions. If business can't come up with them, then so be it. But I think it's a really good opportunity for the government to play a leading role in convening those kind of discussions.
I'm going to briefly Chairman's prerogative and say what I would like him to talk about, and that's one of the things is the 45p tax issue. You may have heard it discussed a little bit in the news.
Tell us more. Tell us more.
The marginal tax rate affecting the rich is something we should worry about. But you know what? The marginal tax rate affecting people at the bottom of the pile coming off universal credit is much more extreme. Yeah. And what I'd like us as a party, as a Conservative Chancellor to do, is to talk about the marginal tax rate effectively affecting people at the bottom and be as worried about them as the high earners. And that's the kind of Conservative Party I want to be part of, and that's what I'd like to hear a bit about today. So this will probably have to be, you could, please clap. Final question, I think, and then we'll have to wrap up. Who have had their hand up the longest? You, so I think. We'll take briefly the two gentlemen there. If you both make your points, and then I'll ask the panelists to be very brief.
Fine. I'm Greenwood, the ex-councillor from Nottingham, and I'd just like to say something about the price capping of energy, which has not really been mentioned in detail. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe more, who cannot get any benefit from what you call a dual fuel. That's a reduction because you have both the gas and the electric. There's many, many people throughout the whole of GB that actually have only got electric. They're having to use all sorts of other, obviously. The major one is LPG, liquid petroleum gas, or CALA to what most people know. And I was descended upon by a considerable amount of elderly people, and I'm not young myself, who have no bank account, they've got no computers, no nothing. So they come along to ex-councillors, when they now come to a place like this, and said, is there any way that LPG can be capped?
LPG can be capped.
Oh, sorry, and the last thing, sorry, I apologise.
Very, very briefly. Please.
Very briefly, yeah. From June to October, it's already gone up 40% this year, the cost of it. Thank you.
Extraordinary, sir.
Hello, my name is Frank. I work for Fair by Design, and I know we've worked with Social Justice, also John Glen as well. We've met before to talk about the poverty premium. We exist to eradicate the poverty premium. We've got a map on our website, if I can shout out very quickly, which will tell everyone the poverty premium in your local constituency as well. So do go have a look at that, and it breaks it down into lots of different
fairbydesign.com.
Yeah, fairbydesign.com. So have a look at that, and I just really want to quickly get the panel's thoughts on what regulators can do to combat the poverty premium. And yeah, in every sector. So Ofgem and the FCA, what they can do to combat it.
Okay, so regulators in the poverty premium and Gas LPG. Let's go, Matt, first. Any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, so with regards to what regulators can do, I think we have to be very careful when we talk about regulators. Not only because it's extraordinarily expensive to constantly keep changing regulation, but because of the law of unintended consequences. I think that the FCA's price cap was a good thing. It's ended a lot of malpractice in the market, and it's sort of moved this sort of high cost further down the line. But I am very sceptical of proposals to put a cap on all forms of credit, because people need to be able to access it. We know that particularly in the sort of the buy now, pay later space right now, that it's the riskiest consumers that are paying the most back on it. And therefore, whenever we seek to legislate and to regulate credit products, I do think we need to be mindful of that. And the same goes for every other regulator.
Thank you. Piers.
Yeah, I mean, just following on from what Matthew said, I'd slightly oppose the view that Matthew has about the buy now, pay later market. I think regulation is really important in that sector. Because I think we're beginning to see people borrowing well beyond their means. I think in terms of regulation more broadly, I think it's really important that we look to see what industry can deliver in consultation with government first. And I think regulation is never off the table, but I think we really need to be looking at business solutions first in order to make this quicker in many ways.
Esther? Regulation is such a huge topic, but we've just got to be mindful that we balance up security, safety, sense of community, as well as with freedoms and removing them. So I'll leave it there. That is such a huge topic. And support for people who are off the grid, absolutely, of course we do, because they can be some of the most vulnerable, and it'd be wrong if we're not supporting them. So absolutely.
Final word. I still think of you as minister, but I must stop calling you minister.
So government can't fix all of those problems around terms of direct payments, and that's why there was always a move to put discretionary pots in the responsibility of local councils to deal with where those gaps exist through the universal provision. And that is sometimes, I think, a bit messy, and that's something that there needs to be perhaps more work to sort of organise some protocols of how that money should be got out. On regulation, look, I think sometimes in the Conservative Party can fantasise about deregulation being a pathway to growth and everything's wonderful. I think Financial Conduct Authority actually have a very good reputation. They will never remove all risk, and we need to be honest with people about the fact that financial services we need to take responsibility for. We need to help people to avoid making mistakes, but we also need to recognise that the government and the regulator can't stop everyone from taking risks. Now, buy now, pay later does need to be regulated because it is being abused by some people, and there's no way of verifying multiple people take out multiple products, and we've agreed to do that. It's complicated to deliver, that's why it's delayed, not because there's a lack of political will. But I put the Financial Conduct Authority and the Prudential Regulatory Authority under a global growth and competitiveness objective, a secondary objective beyond their obligation to have sound and ordered markets. And that's because we also got to recognise that as Conservatives we live in a world where there is innovation in lots of jurisdictions, and we need to be aware of right-sizing our regulations. But what I would say is we need to keep looking at more data, more how to design products so that we can actually use imperfect data sets to let more people lower down the poverty scale access better, more affordable credit. And I just want to finish by talking about help to save, because it astonishes me how little this is known. We have a system in this country where if somebody's on UC or working tax credit just for a day, they can sign up to Help to Save, which allows those people to save £50, up to £50 a month for 4 years. And after 2 years, so somebody could have saved £1,200, the highest balance will be taken and the government will give them 50% of that highest balance. So somebody could get £600 after 2 years, restart the clock after 2 years, save another £50 a month for year 3 and year 4, and get another £600. That's unrealistic for lots of people, but even if people were saving £200 over those 2 years, the government will give them a 50% interest rate. We need to start working through in our communities across the country how to use products like that to build resilience. Now, building resilience now is going to be challenging in the next 6 months, but these are the sorts of things that government has done, and we need to start actually getting them out there. Because it won't be about government direct intervention or regulator quick fixes that will solve and create the solutions, the enduring solutions for the most vulnerable in society.
Thank you, John. That's a perfect note on which to end. Can I thank all of you for coming today? I hope you will look at our Fringe Guide and perhaps join us on a future occasion. And if you do follow us on Twitter, please do, CSJ Think Tank. That would be a good way of you keeping in touch with all that we do. And the final thing I'd just like to do is to thank our panel, not forgetting James from Opinion, who's starting us off with those really helpful slides. Thank you, James. Matt, John, Piers, particularly grateful for our partnership with you, Virgin Money, and Esther, my colleague. Thank you all very much for coming, and have a good lunch.